Welcome, everybody. This is Living Between Worlds for May 15th, 2024. This is the fifth session of the fifth year of this Conversation for Possibility that I began in the early days of COVID, remarking at the congruence of the pandemic crisis and the climate crisis, the similarity of the curves that we were seeing, the trends that we were seeing, and the need and flawed possibility of global response at the speed and scale that these kinds of crises require. Really glad to have you here today. Some of you have seen my mailings of this last week, noting a number of anniversaries that have somehow shown up in my life. So I want to talk about a little bit about time and points in time and perspective on where we've come, not just me individually, but we as a movement in the world, where we've come, where we are, where we might be going, um, on this quest to learn how to do business and do everything else as though we actually belong to the living world. So let's see how we want to do this. So, there's Ken, why don't you bring up that slide for a moment? I turned 75 early this year. I've been at this work for all my adult life. 50 years, we just 2 weeks ago celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. That's ilsr.org for people who want to take a look at it, which I co-founded in Washington, D.C. Back then, remarkable organization, has done so much more than we ever imagined over the past 50 years. 25 years ago, this last Sunday, we started Natural Logic. As a strategy boutique focused on transforming how businesses do business in relation to environment in the living world. 20 years ago in that work, I wrote the Declaration of Leadership for Sustainable Business. You'll find that at declarationofleadership.org. An interesting piece, a client said, could you just cut through and not give me all of the piled on stuff we have to do, but just give me the heart of the matter. What's the truth, not hedging at all. Tell me what's so. And it was one of those remarkable occasions where I just sat down and wrote, and the whole thing came out in 25 minutes. I looked at it the next day to see if I could edit it. There was nothing to edit. I looked at it last week. There was nothing to edit. So that was 20 years ago. 10 years ago, I started what was going to be a 2-year secondment as the first chief sustainability officer for the city of Palo Alto. 5 years later, I moved on from that after we had passed unanimously what was probably the most aggressive climate action plan of any city in the country. And then 5 years ago, we began these conversations of living between the worlds. So I'm kind of sitting there looking back at like, wow, that's a lot of stuff, a lot of momentum. And, we've accomplished, I'm going to use we in many senses. Ken Homer tends to bust people on the sloppy use of we, but I'm going to use it in the multiple dimensions of we, us on this call, we in this work. We, humanity, we're so much further along than we ever imagined possible 20, 25 years ago. I mean, it's stunning. You look at the price and performance of renewable technologies, renewable energy, the penetration of solar, more recently, the penetration of EVs, the progress in the place of women in society, the problem across racial divides, the progress there, obviously incomplete. But look back to videos from the 60s or 70s or even 80s, and you'll see stunning cultural differences. Regenerative agriculture, not just on the move around the world, but in the conversations. I was stunned a few months ago to hear the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, talk about soils and soil fertility and soil regeneration. A conversation I never expected out of that person's mouth. And at the same time, so much less than we need. Emissions are rising, seas are rising, soil loss continues, toxic proliferation continues, biodiversity loss continues. Democracy is at risk, not just in the United States. Can you bring up the next one, the next piece of the slide? Not just in the United States, but 40% of the world's population has national elections this year. And democracy is explicitly or implicitly on the ballot in just about all of them. So here we sit in time, 6.5 months to the U.S. election. I hope everybody's hard at work on that, getting people registered and getting, preparing to get the vote out. Lots of talk around climate has been 2030 targets. That's 6 years away. The good news is that lots of companies, lots of countries, lots of cities have made strong and sometimes bold pledges of emissions reductions by that date, nobody's on track. 16 years to 2050, that's sort of the make or break date the scientists tell us on climate. Nobody's on track. Um, you know, 2100 sounds really far away. It's 76 years away. That might sound really long to you, but for me, that's about as long as I've lived. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition in the turn of time for me to sit in there. And there's a remarkable book called 4,000 Weeks, which is about how many weeks you have in an about 80-year lifetime. It's a lot, and it's finite. And it's really interesting from a planning perspective. You might, an exercise I invite you all into is kind of do the count for yourselves and think about that if you have, 2,000 or 1,000 or 500 or, 350 weeks left actuarially, what are you going to do? Because obviously there's all sorts of stuff you're not going to do. We all have big to-do lists and wish lists and aspirations. And part of the art of art, frankly, as well as the art of world changing, is to say no to certain things. Like, here's something that's important and compelling, and I'm not going to do it because I'm going to focus here. So those are some of the things that I'm observing from this vantage point. Let me say a couple of other things that I'm observing. One is the evolution and the, how shall I say this? The evolution and the weakness of the conversations about sustainability. It's a funny thing where I still tend to say sustainability. The cool kids are saying regeneration as the replacement word. We've seen an evolution of the language from talking about environmental protection to sustainability to regeneration. Sorry, we've got phones going off somewhere, but it sounds like regeneration is the new kid on the block, but actually that was the conversation even before sustainability. Sustainability came into the lexicon in the early 1980s with the Brundtland Commission. Robert Rodale, Buckminster Fuller, and others were talking about regeneration back in the 1970s and 1960s. So we see trends in the words. And I don't want to get caught up in the fashion, but just to note that we are returning literally to the roots, to the question of how do we preserve and enhance the regenerative capacity of the living systems on Earth that undergird everything that we value. And so to the business people and policy people who consider this to be a peripheral matter to be attended to when convenient, that ain't it. It's the foundation of everything. You look at the economic stack all the way down, and it comes down to soil and sunlight and biodiversity. So there's that. There's the conversation of the doomers and the doomsters, kind of evolving into a little bit of distinction there. The doomers, folks who think that catastrophe is inevitable and that efforts to avert it are futile. The doomsters, I don't know where this distinction came from, are people who are pessimistic, but who are focused on active engagement to provoke action to hopefully mitigate or turn the ship. I'm participating in lots of conversations these days, online and elsewhere, and I'm struck at the lack of conversation about power. There's lots of talk about should and will, and we could, and we might, but very little discussion about power and the formation and accumulation and exercise of power. In simple terms, I see this as a progressive movement that is lost in its aversion to the way power has been wielded and not recognizing that power is part of the story. That's why we have power in the subtitle of this series. Growing conversation about capitalism, but shallow, superficial. We've seen for decades now a myriad of efforts at reform of capitalism and socially responsible capitalism, conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, and so forth. None of these, as far as I can tell, addressing the 6 or so structural defects that are there in the foundational architecture of what capitalism is and how it works. And without addressing those, we don't get to where we need to get to. I think it's Brad Warren who taught me that prescription without diagnosis is malpractice, and the malpractice is insufficient. And in a lot of conversations, people are focusing on, well, like, what do we do next? How do we get from here to next year or to 2030 or make the steps we need to make? And uh, uh, little awareness of the power of backcasting. Um, a concept I learned from both the Natural Step and from Bucky Fuller 50 years ago. Backcasting is not setting a goal for the future and planning how to get there. That's called planning. Backcasting is standing in the imagined successful future and reverse engineering the mission backwards in time, which is a powerful technique when you face impossible changes, when you're in situations where you don't know where to go from here. And kind of invent a path backwards. It's, you know this if you've ever done mazes in a newspaper. We know this because this is how NASA designed the Apollo mission to land a man on the moon and bring him back alive in the 1960s. So those are some of the things that are on my mind in this moment. Where I'm focusing is in a couple of dimensions. One is to build a new kind of financial institution, a cooperative holding company, to advance the employee ownership climate relevant economy in the United States. That's a big and a slow undertaking. We'll talk about that more another time. I'm especially focusing on asking these kinds of questions, seeing where I can shift the conversation, both through my writing and speaking, and very directly through executive coaching work, working one-on-one with world changers, people like you and others, people who are executives or entrepreneurs or investors or creators who are committed to a world that works, and finding that I can help, if I can help them individually, one by one, be more successful, more impactful, more sane in the times that we're living in, and maybe even more joyful, then that's a place where I have a lot of leverage. So that's what's up for me. I'm interested in what's up for you. But before we hear from you, Ken, I think you're going to want to throw some questions my way.
I am indeed. First of all, I'm going to stop the screen share, but let me just say, on behalf of, I think, everyone in the room, happy birthday. 75 years, that's a milestone. Good on you. And so let's start with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Tell us, what's that about? What was the mission? And you've said it's gone way beyond where it started from, but just give us a little backstory on that, if you would, please.
The intuition that started it was that there's an incredible locus of opportunity in cities. I had come fresh out of the World Game Workshop with Bucky and crew, looking at the ecological possibilities of the planet. My co-founders, David Morris and Neil Seldman, came out of Neil labor activist background. David had just returned from some time in Chile during the popular unity government, had written a book on that remarkable democratic revolution stopped in its tracks by a US and UK sponsored coup. And David had been working with Carl Hess, libertarian, former speechwriter for Barry Goldwater, of all things, on the notion of local power, community, neighborhood power, what could be done at local level of cities and neighborhoods within cities. I was looking at cities ecologically as places that have resources, flows of energy, cycles of materials, economic flows. And we asked the question of what could be done to make urban communities in the Eastern United States relatively self-reliant, local self-reliance. We talked about it, not isolated, living on sunlight, growing their own food, cycling their own waste, and cycling their economies. One of the pieces of work we did showed that the economic impact of bringing in a chain supermarket into a city was far less than small community-owned or cooperatively owned enterprises that cycled money multiple times locally. So that was the instinct. Could you look at cities as though they were ecosystems? Could you look at cities as though they were underdeveloped countries, where underdevelopment is always a verb, not a noun? Negative balance of trade that depresses the economy of a city. And so we did what was probably the first rooftop farm in the United States, a mile from the White House. Community composting businesses, lots of work around community solar, community broadband, community ownership, antitrust work. That's how it's evolved from that original instinct. But the instinct was people in place have resources and they can collaborate to make something happen together at a very different scale than we usually think of.
And
I'll tell you, it was so inspiring. I was there for the first, I don't know, 5 years or so to see what people have done with the original seed in the next 45 years, still true to the vision, but elaborated far beyond we ever imagined.
it's fantastic. And pretty much the
Encourage you to
same.
take a look. There's a bunch of newsletters, hundreds of projects around the country. Remarkable organization, and you're welcome to donate.
Got to get that plug in there.
Yeah.
And sort of the same thing for Natural Logic. What was the impetus behind that? And what would you consider to be your most successful, the most successful thing about Natural Logic?
Oh, golly. Well, I've been doing sustainability consulting for probably 10 years, eight or 10 years before we started it. The specific impetus was that we built out of a number of client engagements, tools for tracking the metabolism of companies and regions, mapping the flows of energy and materials and turning those into clear and understandable performance metrics that people could actually engage with to change behavior. And we saw enormous power of simply giving people visual feedback on how well they're doing in relation to what their expectations are. Not training them, not exhorting them, not giving them incentives, but just giving them visual feedback of, your trend is looking like this, or your trend compared to your neighbors, or your other facility in your company, or your company compared to another company. We found that to be an enormously powerful lever of change. It's just reminding me of the theory of change at self-reliance, but we can come back to that in a little bit. Well, actually, it's the same thing. Showing people what's possible has a different kind of power than telling people what should be done. Because Ken Boulding said years ago, existence is proof of the possible. If I can show you something that exists, you might tell me you don't want it. You might tell me you don't want to invest in it, but you can't tell me it can't be done if I can show it to you there on the landscape. And if it's something as concrete as, a LEED platinum building that you can walk into and feel the difference in your body, that's powerful lever of change. So we were building these tools. I remember a meeting we had at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory talking about this, and they were blown away by what we had built. And I said, kind of, oh, shucks moment. I said, well, this is just Excel. And they laughed and said, well, Reagan's Star Wars program for the missile defense system was just Excel. So that was an interesting moment. So we decided, this was late in the 1990s as the internet bubble was racing on, that this was something that could be built as a corporate sustainability app. First, it was really the first, as far as I know, the first corporate sustainability dashboard. We incorporated as Natural Logic to raise capital at what turned out to be the tail end of the bubble. Problem number one. On problem number two, we were talking about things that nobody had any grasp of. One large corporation bought a license, nobody else was ready to play. Today, the world is awash in products like this. We were too early, didn't know how to sell it. So, but I think that that perspective about helping people be really clear on what are the metrics that really matter, and how do you measure them in a way that is in context and meaningful, and then deploy them in a way that's not a 200-page sustainability report at the end of the year, but a live interactive tool that people can not only manage to, but can sit around together, multiple people looking at the same graph trends together, and then having a conversation about, what do you see here? What does that mean to you? What do you think is possible? Kind of like, this is newfangled stuff, but it's the oldest human technology, maybe, of us sitting around a fire in a circle at the end of the day, 50,000 years ago, and talking about what happened that day and what we hope to do together the next day. So we were trying to recreate that experience inside the modern corporation.
I'm going to say who's we, because you keep saying we, and I believe Bill Reed was your partner in this, was he not?
Bill was my partner for several years. Bill led our green building program. Bill and I argued a lot about the value of metrics, and the place of analytics in the transformation of humans. That's a conversation we still have to this day. But for me, this was, I'm intentionally being messy on the we, Ken, because I'm always working to extend the we, or to blur the we, or to shuffle the different we groupings together to
Mhm.
see what emerges from that conversation.
Yeah.
Because, bottom line, none of us is as smart as all of us.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, so what are you most proud about from Natural Logic? Is there something that you stands out in your mind of this was just the pièce de résistance?
Uh, Let me answer in two ways. One is that we were among the earliest people. There were a few others, but we were among the earliest people who talked about sustainability not as a nice thing to do, but as a strategic element of business, a strategic value driver of business, something that actually produces. And this is part of the selling logic of it. We will help you make more money, build brand, reduce risk, build employee loyalty, build customer loyalty, et cetera, by doing good for the planet. Um, and so, I'm not going to take the credit for that individually, but we and a number of others contributed to that becoming part of the mainstream conversation,
Mhm.
increasingly in business. As we've talked about previously, we had Andrew Winston, one of these other players, as a guest a year and a half ago on this call. And both of us talked about how we're tearing out our remaining hair, talking to really capable executives at very good companies who still don't seem to get it, who still say, well, sustainability, wonderful, I'd love to do it. We can't afford to. And our response is always, well, which part of this set of data can you not, which part of increased profit, reduced risk, et cetera, can you not afford to do? So
Mhm.
I'm proud of it and I'm not satisfied, frankly. Um, the other thing which bears on this is we had an engagement with a client, a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing company. I'm not going to say their name for reasons that'll become obvious. Um, we we did a very novel modeling of their entire supply chain, asking the question of where does the value leak from your supply chain, both upstream suppliers coming to you and downstream as it moves from you to the customers. And obviously, there's things like using too much energy in manufacturing. Okay, so waste material that's not turning into product. Okay, great. But we found lots more, including in the operations, in the business structure, and in the offers the company was making to the marketplace. We built a map with
Mhm.
cross-functional team, which is the way we always work. We always, because none of us is smart of all of us, we want people from across the company, and laterally in different levels hierarchically, because different people see different things. The map was kind of stunning. We said we were at the end. That was the end of the engagement. We said the next step is to calibrate this thing, figure out what these different flows, how big they are, and what they're worth. And we offered to do that as the next engagement. They said no, and it was partly they didn't want to spend, and partly I think they wanted to run the numbers themselves because a consultant could have an agenda. I think they wanted to neutralize, which is fair enough. And as we left, we said, would you let us know what you find out? They said yes. We said, well, we predict it's going to be a very large number. They said, yeah, we'll see. And they sent us on our way. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the global head of strategy for this, whatever, $6 or $10 billion global company, who said, well, Gil, we got a number. I said, great. Steve, tell me what it is. And he said, you'll be interested to know that it was not a very large number. And I remember the moment. It was like, like my eyes rolled back in my head. The gears started racing furiously, trying to figure out how could that possibly be? There's no way it couldn't be a large number based on what I knew. And he said, so he said it couldn't be a large, it was not a very large number. He waited the requisite 2 beats of an impeccable stand-up comedian. And he said, it was a massive number. Okay. Okay. And I took a breath and said, how massive? He said, about twice as big as our total global revenue. Wow. So, so I'm proud of that. And
That
that
sounds amazing.
replicated across, you can imagine what that replicates. So
So I'm curious, based on what you've shared so far,
yeah,
and what I know of the people on this call, I think we're all, trying to find the leverage points to and the place to stand because you need both a lever and a place to stand. What's something you've learned from Natural Logic that if you were going into a community or an organization that you would bring with you that would really help you to get that point across? Because there's so much of resistance of we can't afford it, we can't afford it, can't afford it. Where's the point that cracks that thinking open into, wow, Is it just the numbers or is there something else?
It's a great question. I don't know. There's not a single simple answer to that. If I knew the simple answer, we'd be way further ahead than where we are now, because I wouldn't keep that a secret. Um, what I've learned a lot of things, not just at Natural Logic, but in other work around and since. I think probably the most important thing I've learned is to listen really deeply, is to listen not just to what people say, but to what people really care about.
Hmm.
Because in my experience, when we do that, here's the we again, when we listen deeply, not just to the words we say to each other, but to the things we really care about, we find an enormous amount of common ground, even across apparent fierce differences. Um, um, we And so I'm listening, I'm listening, as we've talked about here, not just at words, I'm listening for people's mood. I'm listening for the assessments that people are making as they stand in the world that are tangled with those moods. I mean, case in point, my friend and colleague Chauncey Bell claims that the most common mood in organizations of any kind in North America is resignation. Right? This is the way things are. There's nothing much I can do about it. And that's you all know this. You've experienced this. This is a common mood. That's an option that we live in. There's a mood of there could be a mood of ambition. I see possibilities here, and I like that, and I'm going to engage about that. Kind of at odds with each other. There's moods of acceptance. This is how things are. It's okay. I'm fine. I'm not depressed about it. It's just realistic about it. There's moods of resentment. Things are crappy, and it's their fault. It's all their fault. See how these tie together. The interesting thing about mood is that they're tangled with assessments. If I'm in a mood of resignation, the assessments I'm going to make, the judgments, the opinions I'm going to have about things are going to tend to be negative and no possibility. Why? Because, it's resignation. Flip side, if I'm encountering situations again and again and again where I feel stuck and I don't see possibility, my mood may in fact be resigned. And these things loop together and reinforce each other. And so I'm learning that listening for that and starting to untangle that tangle and help people see it and reflect on it and find small places to shift can have enormous leverage at level of personal being in the world, at the level of strategy in an organization, and even at the level of the political divide that we are facing in this country. Because, and call me crazy for saying this, but there's a lot of common ground between people on the left and the right. You couldn't tell it by watching MSNBC and Fox News, but you can tell it if you sit down at a bar with somebody and have a conversation. It's not easy. It's very easy to get hooked, for me as well as for them. But when I can listen past that, well, I've shared a story before with some of you here that one of my dearest friends was a Trump voter in 2016. We were introduced by a mutual pal who loved and respected us both. I went into the conversation thinking I was going to change his mind about climate. I realized pretty quickly that that was a non-starter and frankly not legitimate unless I was open and willing to have him change my mind about things. And, we changed each other's minds some. We had a deeply respectful and really fascinating conversation where I heard things that I don't usually hear in the bubbles that I live in. And we became fast friends. We love each other. Would I have predicted that I would out of one conversation love a Trump voter? Absolutely not. And yet it happened. And so for me, I'm intrigued by what's the possibility that something like that opens.
Hmm.
So it's a long answer to your question about what have I learned. It's something about listening as one of the, rather than saying, as one of the key tools of change. Merle Hansen, the great Midwest farm organizer, used to say that the good Lord gave you two ears and one mouth that you might listen twice as much as you speak. And the first time I heard that, I heard it at the kind of mechanical level. I now hear that at a much deeper level about human being, what it is being human, and how we change. So,
That's a great answer to the question, and it brings up a lot for me because I also have learned about listening, and listening for different, you know, what am I listening for when I come into a conversation? Am I listening for facts that I can argue with? Am I listening for things that where you agree with me, so I don't have to think very much? Or am I listening when you disagree? Do I need to prove my point, or can I be open to that? These are all really important questions. And about the moods, I find all the time, especially on LinkedIn, which is now my only social media, I'll post something positive, and the people in moods of resignation and resentment are saying that'll never happen. They're defending the fact that they're in this mood of resignation. It's impossible. Why are you bothering? And I just keep saying, like you say, but if look around, if you stop watching the news and start getting involved in conversations with people, you'll find something very different is going on. I saw Lawrence Lessig give a talk here at Dominican University a few years ago, and he said, our our research shows that 92% of people agree on the major things that have to happen, and yet Congress can't seem to pass any of it. And
This,
then the
and this
media
has
says
been true.
it's polarized.
This has been true for 50 years. The People's
Yeah.
Bicentennial Commission in 1976 did polling on major issues. The country polled 70 to 90%. Unified, relatively progressive, depending on what you call things. Call them by different names, and the unity shifts. So yeah, absolutely. And the thing about listening, I would let me suggest to, I'm going to suggest this to all of you because I know it to be true about myself, is that we don't listen. Listening is not the same as hearing the sounds as what somebody says. It's the meaning that you construct, that we construct out of what we hear. And well, I'm going to say I don't know about you, but I think I do know about you because I know about me and everybody else I've ever spoken with, that when we're in conversations, there's an already listening there. Like Ken, as you said, do I agree with what you're saying? What am I going to say in response? I'm preparing my response. I'm classifying, oh, Ken is saying this kind of thing, it falls into that box, or Alistair is saying this kind of thing, it falls into that box, rather than beginner's mind listening in the moment, open to something new happening and something new emerging. And so just starting to notice that, to notice how I'm trapped in the already listening that I bring into a conversation, and practicing letting that go and being truly open to a discovery is a big thing.
It is a big thing. We could spend a lot of time talking about listening. Somebody recently asked me if I knew the average time between someone talking and the next person talking in New York. And it's less than half a second. People, oh, right, you go to take a breath and they've jumped in.
Yeah, sometimes it's negative half second.
Yeah. In California, it can be as long as 2 seconds. But does anybody have any idea how long it is among indigenous people? Take a guess. Mitch, 10 minutes. You say something and people will wait 10 minutes while they're thinking about what I've heard before they reply. And I thought to myself, what an amazing practice that would be to sit in a room of people that I know, that I talk with regularly, and it would be a long conversation, but to take 10 minutes and just let it sink in. We're both on a call where occasionally we do sort of a Quaker meeting thing. And in Quaker meeting, they say, if you can't improve the silence, don't speak. So a lot of times I don't speak because I can't improve the silence, but that listening, that allowing things to really sink in, and the whole body to catch up with what's going on, and then to speak from that place, I think is enormously powerful and something that I certainly was not capable of when I was younger. I hope I'm learning that now. But speaking of being younger and older, as you look back over 75 years, what do you see for the through lines and the patterns that connect that assure you that you're on the right path and that you're doing the right work? Because it certainly seems from the outside that you're there.
There's a through line in terms of what I've been doing. That's for sure. I encountered Bucky in 1972, ran away from home to join the World Game. And all my pals ran off to the first Rainbow Family Gathering to smoke dope and run naked in the Rockies all summer. I went and did research on planetary trends and transitions. And I signed on for that mission, and that's been the work of my adult life. I was talking with a colleague yesterday and said, if I had won the Mega Millions lotto thing last night and never had to work another day in my life, I would do what I'm doing now. So that through line is clearly there. The more, I forget the words you used to say it, but how am I sure? I'm not. How could I be? You know, I'm doing, as the Charles Schwab the senior said, what, 100 some odd years ago, I'm doing the best I can where I am with what I have. Right. So no, I don't think we get to be sure. We get to decide. We get to commit is what we get to do. We get to say,
Yeah.
we'll do this. I will commit to this, make this, do everything I can to make this happen. And then, ride that as best we can.
I'm remembering, I forget the guy's name. He was Joseph Campbell's mentor. And he said, the thing is, you work your whole life and you really don't know what you've done until the end. And when you look back, and I'm not suggesting that you're at the end, but I'm just wondering if as you look back at your life, you're seeing certain things that stand out and say, yep, I'm so glad I did that. And that really nourished me. And that really makes me feel like I'm on my path.
Yeah.
Might not be the right path, but it's right for you.
Yeah. It feels right for me.
Yeah.
Mostly, there are times where I think, oh, I should have, could have, why didn't I do that? And there, and I'm not summarizing with you the breakdowns and the failures. I was in Vienna for this city conference some years ago, and they had a remarkable evening event they called Fuck Up Nights. It's a thing where people get together and get on stage and talk about their fuck ups. And this was not just entrepreneurs and activists. It's like the mayor of Vienna
Mm-hmm.
under a big banner said "fuck up nice." You wouldn't see that in the United States quite that way. But being frank about what didn't work. And what we learned from Jeffrey Hollander, the founder of Seventh Generation, did this at a Co-op America conference some years ago. He got up on stage for his keynote and he recounted his 10 biggest failures.
Mm.
And then invited everybody at the breakout tables to everybody to talk about their 10 biggest failures. And we had permission from him to do something we wouldn't have done otherwise. Like emotional permission to do that. And it was deeply enriching, rewarding both on the face of it. There's substantive learnings from the failures, but also recognizing these people who you might have held in very high esteem as being, gods of business had many, many, many bumps on the road along the way. So that's another.
That's a great segue because that was going to be my next question is now tell us about something that you did that really taught you a painful lesson.
I will, and I also want to. I'm aware of the top clock ticking, and I want to hear from other folks who are here with us today, because I'm sure there's a lot to be said in the room. But let me. Yeah, God, there are so many. Um, hmm. Well, two that come most to mind. One is that when we were building Business Metabolics, the corporate sustainability dashboard in the late 1990s, early aughts, the word from the investment community was that you have to do it this way. You have to use this technology stack, structure your business in this way, and proceed according to the plan of everybody knows. Well, the everybody knows was out of fashion to 18 months later. We should have said, no, not going to do it that way. We're going to do it the way we want. It may be a slower ramp, but it would have been a ramp rather than a crash and burn. That would be one. Second, actually, to the theme of listening, when I started as CSO of Palo Alto, my friend Danny O'Neill came out of Boston Ward Politics, said, the thing you need to do is you need to spend every day just walking the streets, knocking on doors, walking into every storefront in the city, introducing yourself and listening to what people are up to. And I didn't do that. I didn't have time.
Mm-hmm.
All these responsibilities and things to do, including building programs. It was true inside inside the organization as well. I needed to do a lot more talking and listening with everybody, the 1,000 people who work for the city. I did it some. It wasn't only my failure. There were barriers to doing that. There were there were gates and institutional hierarchy barriers that made it difficult to do that. But that process of engagement by listening, not by preaching, I haven't done well enough in those instances. I think I'm doing it better now. It's a constant learning. I would say those are the two things that come most to mind right now.
Thanks. It reminds me, any New Yorkers on the call remember Abe Beam used to walk around, say to people on the street, "How am I doing?"
Ed
You know,
Koch. Ed Koch.
Ed Koch, right? So I knew it was one of those New York mayors, and it wasn't Lindsay. All right. So before we open it up for everybody else, somebody asked a question early on here, so I can find it in the chat. They wanted to hear more about the 5 or 6 structural issues with capitalism. You up for talking about that right now?
I'm up for not going into it in detail right now. We've got, if you go back into the Living Between Worlds archives, you'll find a couple of sessions on that. I'm writing a book on that in my occasional spare time. But very quickly, if I can remember them all. Accumulation without limit, extraction without reciprocity. Help me out here, somebody look it up. Alienation without solidarity. Sorry, I should have these memorized. I'll find them if you give me a minute.
All right. Well, while you're thinking about that, folks, you've been listening to Gil reflect on his 75 years and some of his accomplishments. What's this stirring for you? Who's got a question for Gil or something that he's stirred in your mind you'd like to share? Please raise your hand and let us know. Stuart.
Yeah. So, Gil, I want to thank you for touching on the milestones in a positive way. I was on a call earlier today with a 20-something who's a whistleblower for Pfizer. And it was just beautiful to see the activism of someone young. So, and I'm sure this is true of so many of us on the call, we worry that all our work has been in vain, that we have been pushing the envelope and pushing the envelope and pushing the envelope. And I just have a sense that percolation is starting to happen. I mean, I'm actually enthused right now about, the possibility of going back into the quote corporate world and seeing what kind of mud I might stir up in that context. Perhaps more important, when you talked about mood and Chauncey, Alan Briskin and Mary Jelinas are writing a book about fields, which I think is really essentially the same thing. And I'm very, very excited about this book about how we are impacted by the fields around us. And so I guess what I take away from you and the milestones and the good work is that keep the faith, okay? And I appreciate and I greatly appreciate that. So thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. I'll just say that one of the things I've learned, I've been kind of tongue-in-cheek describing myself lately as a futurist who's given up predicting the future. I think predicting the future is a fool's game. And thinking that we know what will result from our actions is a fool's game. And the thing to do is to do the best we can and see what happens. And if you doubt that, go find that wonderful Japanese story about the old man and the white horse. Or if you doubt that, go find some Winston Churchill speeches from Britain during the bombardment by the Nazis.
I did want to push back on one thing.
Yeah.
As I'm a month away from my 78th birthday, the idea of an 80-year life, I'm gonna push back against that. Okay.
80, that's just the number that guy ran. I said actuarially. So
to 101, Stuart, to 101.
Thank you, Ken.
So the 6 structural defects of capitalism, and thank you, Marshall, for finding it on my AI. Accumulation without limit, extraction without reciprocity, alienation without care, abstraction without ground, generation without regeneration, and privatization without solidarity. That may not be the complete set. It's close, I think. I'm working on what else, and there's a story behind each of those. But I'm saying that unless we address each of those, we don't get better world that we want. I was on a call yesterday with Marjorie Kelly, brilliant woman, Democracy Collaborative, book out called Wealth Supremacy, which I commend to you to read. And she was saying, look, it's not that there are bad people running these organizations. These organizations are doing what they're designed to do. So we have to change the design. Jan, you may have something to say about that.
Yeah, a little bit. I just I think we met at the Office of Appropriate Technology
We
with
did.
Tom Cashman back in what, 77 or something like that, and
Around there, 78, yeah.
then at Farallon's Institute and
Mhm.
so forth. And I just wanted to say that there's another impact that you've had that you didn't mention, and I'm sure there are many of them. And I really like, Ken, I just really appreciate the way you've drawn out the story of our, one of my heroes and dear friends. Thank you so much for that sensitivity, how you've done that. But the book that I did in 2017 called Mastering Leadership Alignment, Linking Value Creation to Cash Flow, features the notion of a chart of activities as the missing piece in creating measurements that everyone can participate in creating. And the case study is a CPA society that was bankrupt in its 100th year. You and I co-developed the first value cycle map that I ever did. I've done many dozens of them now. The one in the book is going to end up changing the way accounting functions. The guy that wrote the foreword is about to take over the AICPA. So, working with you as a client at Natural Logic, you're doing stuff with the scoreboard, getting you on your accounting side, getting you thinking about measurement around activity, transforming to transaction. You're playing with me in that domain. God, however long ago that was, back when you were looking at scaling Natural Logic, has had a profound impact. And that value cycle map I've replicated over and over, and it does a lot of the things that you're saying don't happen anywhere else. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I also just keep thinking about, if anybody has not seen this book, I encourage you. It's called Impossible: Solving for the Impossible by Scott Spann. And
He's
Scott,
a masterful facilitator.
yeah, who's currently working for the Pachamama Alliance, doing a 70-person response. The 70 smartest people in Pachamama are responding to the Koji letter in Asheville. By the middle of June, there will be a response from humanity, Pachamama speaking for the people of the earth, responding to the Koji letter. If people aren't familiar with that, that's out around it's a Colombian tribe that sent a letter last November. And Scott has offered a free course starting this Friday at 2 p.m. in regenerative.
John, you want to put the link in the chat, please, for that?
Yeah, and basically people can show up and say why they might want to be a part of it. And he's offering to do it on a by donation basis. He wants to train 15,000 people in large scale regenerative systems design, problem solving. So I feel like, you have held a line that I've held with you, and there are a bunch of us that have done that, and our time is coming pretty rapidly. The world is actually waking up to that they need all this stuff, I think, now. So thank you for your leadership and your friendship, and for just being, creating. I mean, ILSR is a miracle if people don't know about it and what it's doing today. Just everything you've done was worth it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. It's very generous of you to say that. It's funny, when we were doing that value mapping thing, I thought I was learning from you.
Well,
isn't this how it sometimes is? I mean, what strikes me about this is so, and Ken, to some of your questions, I have no idea what most of the effect of what I've done is.
Right.
You know, each of us has had thousands of conversations with hundreds or thousands of people in our lives. You don't know what the cause and effect is on that. Sri Nasargadatta is fond of saying, Chauncey is fond of quoting him. He's saying the causes are numberless. The causes of all things are all things. It's not like we're not billiard balls where you can set up a shot and have that thing happen. I remember, Ken, another moment to what you asked me about before. I remember I was speaking at a conference and a gentleman came up after the speech, had a dog-eared copy of The Truth About Green Business in his hands, said, I've been carrying this with me every day for 8 years. I use it every day in my work. Would you please sign it? I was floored. I had no idea. And so I think, all of us have stories like that, some of which we will never know. And all there is to do the best you can in each moment about the things that you really care about. Heather, welcome.
Thank you. I want to join the chorus of voices in gratitude to you, Gil, and to you, Ken. I think I met Gil in, I don't know, 1976, 77. You know, your presence in this world has had a huge impact on my presence in this world. And I just want to say the four-letter word love out loud in this moment, because here where I live, I'm in the trenches around land use policy.
Yeah.
And the design there was to protect white wealth, and the intention was to do that, and it's done a great job. So to change the design for me is where I've been trying to work, and doing that by bringing Danella Meadows' systems change interventions into the conversations. That, I'm not interested in leverage points 2 through 12. I'm interested in leverage point 1, which is the narrative, which is the design. And last week I was in a room with 2 architects and the vice president and chief strategy officer of an architecture firm here where I live. And we were talking about the lack of leadership in land use policy and what the hell were we going to do? Not this cycle, because this cycle's already too late, but the next 10-year cycle, if we were going to, if the private sector was going to show up with some leadership to address the vacuum of leadership in the public sector, what would that look like? And so part of the meeting was me telling my life story about, why am I in the room today at age 75 with people who are more like 40? And towards the end, one of the younger architects who's in the urban league leadership here where I live just looked at me and he said, how is it that you keep on going after all these years?
What'd you say?
Well, I had to think about that for a minute because I wasn't sure, because sometimes I'm in the mood of resignation, but I didn't want to be in that mood that day. So I looked at this young person, and what came to mind was, what keeps me going is the love I have for my family, my children and my grandchildren, and their well-being, and the love I have for this beautiful planet that we live on. And it's love that keeps me going. I got a little leaky. This young man started to tear up, and I could see his whole body change with the notion that what we're all here for is to bring love into the world for well-being for all the people. It's not about, can I make a profit here, or how much profit can I make? All that stuff's important, but the design is from the love for the people and the planet. And if we can, so I'm in the mood for love these days, and it's always perfect, these monthly meetings with you. They somehow always meet me right where I am in the most magical, supportive, regenerating ways. So thank you, Gil, for your life and just the joy you've brought to me, and you too, Ken Homer, through World Cafe and that approach to what can a conversation really look like that brings out the best in people? So I'm in love with the two of you, just so you know.
We don't have that music queued up for I'm in the mood for love. Maybe we'll find that. Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much. I'm really moved by what you're saying, and back at you for all this. It's not just love for all the people, but as the indigenous cultures say, all our relations. Yeah, the whole living web of all of us, that we are all of us a part of. So yeah, absolutely. Um, um, I just let me make a request of all of you. I'm so moved by what Heather just said, and by the story I mentioned before about the guy who'd been carrying around my book for every day for 8 years. There may be people in your life that you want to thank for something. Do it. Please do it. Don't wait to do it. Don't think about doing it someday. Gratitude has enormous generative power in human affairs. Notice what you're grateful for yourself. Take note of that every day. Share what you're grateful with others, both the ones who you're sure know that you feel that way and the ones that don't. And Heather, again, thank you. Alan, welcome.
Unmute. Oh, Gil, my friend, Haber is friend, so we are friends from
Yeah.
the beginning. And my reflection in many of these conversations.
Mhm.
So you're just 75.
Mhm.
In the next 12
Yeah.
years, when you get to be 87, where I am,
Yeah.
I think you will engage more with the unhappy fact that besides the human tendency to cooperate, to help one another, to care and share and recognize our commonalities, to regenerate all this, there's also the system of domination, ultimately the system of war. And that is what is undermining the cooperative impulse. Because even as the dominator sees, well, I can do better if I also do some cooperation, they're still reinforcing and accepting their way into this model of hierarchy, authority, command, and ultimately deceit, greed, violence, and war. And that is what we have to deal with, as well as how do we maintain a cooperative economy. And
Alan, are you resigned?
no, I'm not resigned. I've been working at this for the last 12 years. After I passed 75 and saw there was more than the cooperation, that is essential. But we are in a war system, and there are 140 armed struggles going on around the world now, and somehow the civil society, the consciousness that is shared in this group beautifully so many times over these 5 years and over all your years, has yet to see how do we focus in a way on this dominating system of full spectrum that the Pentagon is funding with $700 billion plus.
Alan, could you reflect on one experience you've had where you've seen people shift from domination frame to cooperative frame at any scale? Can you give me one? Because I bet you have.
I just got a little food from Odile, who greets you also.
Oh, deal. And I don't ask that to put you on.
When I began, I became a woodworker back in 1969. And I thought that we needed some kind of cooperative shop. We
Mhm.
call it the Splinter Group. And people initially came in with their own sense of individual location. But as we developed, we actually became a cooperative shop where people shared work and shared knowledge. And uh, we transformed that original knowledge that everybody is their own entrepreneur
Mhm.
and became a cooperative, a collaborative,
Mhm.
a working with wood, a co-creative process,
Yep.
which lasted a while, and then other factors intervene, and
It's
uh,
a great example, and I ask you that because what I talked before about the importance of diagnosis, understanding the war system, understanding the economic drivers, paying real attention to that is really critical, as is noticing that humans have done other things and have the capacity to do other things. And so somehow we need to be able to look with two eyes, binocular vision, see depth, to be able to see both of those. So, Alan, thank you. I'll let you return to your meal and see who else has something for you here. Thanks very
thank
much.
you. Well, this turn of heart, this change of consciousness is just a flip of awareness away. And that's what is so engaging because people really can shift from being in it to being a spectator that they want to be from another place. And that's the beauty of this moment. The tension is just building in people because it's not as a conscious way for humanity to live. It is the whole life system in rebellion.
Alan,
Thanks.
thank
I just want to comment on this. I'm watching the chat, and there's a lot going on in the chat about gratitude practice. And as a coach, I've been assigning gratitude practice for people for ages, but it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I discovered it for myself because 2 months into the pandemic, my wife and I were sitting every night going, "Oh, we can't go out to eat. We can't see our friends. We can't do this." And I said, if we don't stop with the I can't, I'm going to go crazy. And so every night we sat down and we talked about 5 things we were grateful for. Number one on the list was Netflix because it kept us going, right? And after a few weeks, I went, I've really felt my mood shift. It's like it lightened the load of the pandemic to actually every night talk about what we're grateful for in the middle of great deprivation. So I have to say it is an enormously powerful practice, and don't just give it lip service. Really try it because it will shift your mood dramatically.
It's actually at the core of many spiritual traditions world
Yeah.
around. I
Yeah.
had a singing teacher years ago, a woman named Felicia Sloan, ruby throated voice, just remarkable singer and teacher. And at the end of every practice session, about 10 of us, she would bring out a beautiful polished wood bowl. And in the bowl was filled with polished stones. And she talked about a gratitude practice of everybody would take a stone from the bowl and say something they were grateful for, and lay it to the side in another bowl. And we each did that. And she said, okay, now do it again. And we went around again. There were 100 stones in the bowl. There were 10 of us. So each of us had 10 gratitudes to raise. And the initial thought, I know for me, and certainly for some other people, was I can't think of 10 things I'm grateful for. But it was like exercising a muscle and learning how to be quiet and notice and find it. And week after week, it got easier and easier, and there was more to say. Felicia did the whole bowl every night by herself.
Wow.
100 things she was grateful for every day. And that may sound impossible, but think about what happens to your orientation in the world when you pay attention to that. Yeah.
So I want to say something related here, which is that there's something called appreciative inquiry. It was originated by a fellow by the name of David Cooper Ryder at Case Western Reserve University, and it's the antidote to problem solving. And when we're facing the kind of messes that we're facing, problem solving is not going to work anyway. So what you do in appreciative inquiry is you define what it is you want to talk about, and then you say, what's already working? What's the best that's already going on? What's supporting this going forward? And then you dream about what can we actually bring forward? What can we create that will complement that? And so the whole thing is it's not Pollyanna. It's not where we're going to just look at good stuff because we have to look at the stuff that's not working or design what will work. And I've tried to design all the questions I ask Gil today from an appreciative standpoint. And I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm trying to strengthen what's already working. And I have a great quote from Vandana Shiva. Those of you who know Vandana is an amazing woman in India. And when asked why she doesn't burn out, she said, well, it's always a mystery because you don't know why you get depleted or why you get recharged. But this much I know. I don't allow myself to be overcome by hopelessness, no matter how tough the situation. I believe that if you just do your little bit without thinking about the bigness of what you stand against, if you turn the enlargement of your own capacities, it just creates new potential. And I've learned from the Bhagavad Gita and other teachings of our culture to detach myself from the results of what I do, because that's not in my hands. The context is not in my control, but my commitment is. I can make the deepest commitment possible, and it will take me places. If I want to lead a better world and I shape my actions, take responsibility of them, then I detach from the outcome. And I think that's really something that's very important and shows up a lot in this call and others of we've got to work as hard as we can, do what we can with what we have, celebrate our successes, mourn our losses, and no matter how bad things look, keep putting one foot in front of the other and bring that love that Heather was talking about forward, because that is where we're going to actually, end up in the long run, making the difference that makes a difference.
And what does this have to do with climate strategy and climate finance and carbon emissions and corporate net zero pledges and community economic development and racial justice and all of that? Everything.
Yeah. So Gil, I'm going to let you turn it around. I've been asking you questions. You've been asking you questions. Do you have questions for people here today that you'd like to pose and get some responses to?
Thanks, Ken. Since there's no hands up, it's it's my usual two questions. What does this provoke for you? I know there's a lot in the chat. I can't read the whole chat while I'm also paying attention to you on screen. But if one or two of you care to say what has this conversation provoked for you? What's generated for you? And the parallel question about, okay, now what? How are you going to take this conversation into your life and your relationships and your work? Those are always my two questions. George, you're up first. And then Shell.
I raised my hand earlier because I wanted to say something about love. When I was in high school, I read an essay by E.M. Foster that he wrote in World War II, just at the beginning, I think, when things were really bad. And it's called On Tolerance. And it's informed my life since then, because what he talked about was you have to know somebody in order to love them. And for him, as the movie title says, there's a thin line between love and hate. So he was suggesting tolerance and respect as probably a more useful term than getting everybody to love each other. If we can tolerate each other, that's a major step forward. If we can respect each other, that's a major step forward. To expect us to love everyone, maybe a little bit too much. And I don't want to criticize Heather or anybody else for having that feeling, for having that open heart. But I would just like to maybe dial it down a little bit so that those of us whose hearts are not so completely open can still participate, so that we can find a ground on which we can stand and then maybe build towards that. Now, whether that's a mood of resignation or a mood of exaltation, I don't know. But I am very happy that the idea of gratitude has come out so so strongly today.
Yeah.
Because as I put in the chat, I've been doing my gratitude meditation, which is deepened and deepened over time for probably 15 years now.
Mhm.
And it really has done a lot for me. So thanks to you all with gratitude, respect, and tolerance, but not love, because I don't know you all that well in order to love you.
Get to know us, man. So yeah, look, dial it to wherever it works for you. I forget who I heard this from, but somebody talked about when you're stuck in a terrible mood that you don't like and you can't see how to get to the mood you want to be in, what's the next best available mood? What's like the little inch of progress you can make? You may not be going from resignation to ambition and enthusiasm. You might go from resignation to acceptance. The other thing, what you said provokes me, George, is the lesson I learned from Rabbi Ferenc Roy, that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And that may be another way to move through this landscape of stuff. Thank you, George. Shel Horowitz.
Okay, this has been a really rich conversation. I feel very validated in a lot of things, not just my gratitude practice. And also kind of in awe of how much you've accomplished. I think I first heard about Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I certainly think I knew about it when I lived in DC in 1975, and maybe even earlier. I think I may have come across it in Wing magazine, like in the early 70s sometime. And yeah, just the good you've done in the world in so many areas is wonderful and uplifting to me, because it shows that the work that I've been trying to do these last 20 years is still possible, and there are people making a living at it, which I have. Most of my living comes as a book shepherd of socially conscious and environmentally conscious books, so it's in the same territory, but it's not the hands-on consulting I'd really like to be doing, and the extensive speaking. In response to George, who is, by the way, a very nice person to hang out with, we went out for ice cream in Cambridge, must have been about half a year ago. I come out of the LGBT world, which I was very active in the 70s and 80s. And the word tolerance is something of a loaded word in that world, because we who have been marginalized, we don't want to be tolerated. We want to be accepted. As to whether one can love people you don't know personally, I think you can. I mean, Gil, one of your mentors is Bucky Fuller. I never got to meet him. I don't like his writing style, but I love the things he brought to the world.
I love his writing style.
I struggled so much reading Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. But, I went to Dearborn and I saw the Demaxian house, and it made so much sense. And, stuff like that. He really, I find the way to Bucky is to look at what he's actually produced as opposed to what he's talking about, how he produced it.
Yeah. This is, I'm laughing, Shel, because it's a great window into our utter subjectivity. I encountered an operating manual for Spaceship Earth when I was, 23 years old. I thought it was the most lucid thing I'd ever read, even though it had sentences that went on for 3 pages.
Yep.
And I handed it to Jesse Clark, my roommate, said, "You got to read this." And he spent a half hour with me, said, "I can't make any sense out of this at all." So, your mileage may vary.
I need to ask Jan what that means that you just put in the chat. Grunch of Giants.
Gross universal cash heist.
It's a book of Bucky's that is not very well known, and is a perspective on corporate domination of the planet. It's a really interesting piece of work.
Companion to Critical Path,
Yeah.
which is my first Bucky book. And I had to read it 3 times to understand what the hell the guy was talking about.
Look, we each of us bring to every moment our entire histories, our biology, our lineage, our physicality, the conversations we've been in, the relationships we've had. None of us is showing up fresh in any moment. It's everything we see is out of what we're encountering and what we're bringing to it. And we will see things differently. And that could either be a terrible problem or a rich opportunity for gratitude, right? What do we do now? What do we do together? So we got a few minutes left here. Would love to hear from more of you. What's up? What's going on inside your being? Sometimes I threaten to call on people. I'm not going to do that today. This is for you each trust. Jan, let me hold off on you for a moment, see if anybody else wants to jump in.
Sure.
Gil, I
Just
can,
had a short comment.
With that,
Since nobody was raising their hand, I just want to say that I don't know what other people's experience is, but it feels like the last 6 or 8 weeks, something has shifted in life around me, and where I was feeling everything diverging and all these different things going on, it's like every day things are just converging in a new way. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed that, but it feels like life is assembling something in a way that I've never seen before in the 40 plus years I've been doing this. So I'm just feeling quite in awe every day, just the magic that's unfolding and saying things I've been saying a long time, and people are actually going, huh, instead of, huh, and so anyway, I don't know if anyone else has noticed that shift, but it feels to me the last couple of months, since mid-January, life is up to something. Anyway, I'm just noticing.
I noticed that my internet's a mess today. It stopped being a mess just in time for this call. So that's pretty nice. Mary Ann, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Gil. I have a question, but I also just wanted to comment that one of the things that's in the context of who I know you to be is that you've always and continue to be deeply a spiritual inquirer. And I think that is sort of the context out of which the we comes. You know, there's something that you've discovered in that inquiry that is behind what informs all of what you do, which is just extraordinary. So I just appreciate seeing that about you and knowing that about you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And yeah, and just all of us is more than one of us. I mean, just really the possibility that together we can do what none of us can do alone is pretty amazing. So my question has to do with soil, because you said the 2 areas of solution that you see, one of them is soil, and you didn't say anything else about it. So, I just wonder where your attention is in terms of what you see and could guide us toward in terms of looking at soil.
We should probably do a whole session just on that. But let me say a few words. As I said earlier on, it may have been before you joined the call, everything that we value, everything that we care about, everything that we measure, everything that we invest in, rises from the living soil and the ability of the living soil to sustain plants that capture off-planet energy from the nuclear reactor 93 million miles away and turn it into structures of sugars and starches and proteins that become the plants that we eat and the animals that eat them that we eat, and become us and become the things, the things that we make. All of that is coming from that process. Living soil is the foundation of it. And it's a miraculous thing. And it's an example of where we have built a prosperous society by mining rather than regenerating. A lot of the wealth of the United States stands on the topsoil of the Great Plains, which has been, significantly depleted over the last 200 years. We lose soil faster than we make it. A lot of people think we can get around that through hydroponic, aquaponic, non-soil agriculture. I think it's got its place, but it's got its real limits. It turns out, and my wife and partner Jane Bird, who couldn't be on the call today, has been doing a lot of research into this. It turns out that soil and vegetation and the water cycle are a critical element of climate balance. It's not just CO2. It's how we move water vapor. You know, we don't see vegetation where it rains. We get rain where there's vegetation. So there are things about these cycles that we haven't understood well. And so it's a place for deep inquiry and important work and challenges to a lot of assumptions. Our friend Hunter Lovins, who was guest a few months ago, will tell you with great enthusiasm that cutting meat out of your diet is not the contribution to make the climate change. That in fact, we need regeneratively raised animal protein for ecological reasons, as well as whatever nutrition reasons you might want to argue. So can of worms that we're opening up here, speaking of worms and soil, right? But I think it's a topic for a future call. For those of you, yeah, thank you, George. I was about to mention Walter Yenny, who is a person who can teach you a lot about this, Australian agronomist, very interesting stuff, a bunch of YouTube videos that will either piss you off or blow your mind.
Dale, you look like you want to say something.
Please.
You're gonna have to unmute yourself though.
Okay, unmute. I find that words show up in my life. People were talking about spontaneous things. Here's a really short few words that showed up in my life, and I'm going to tell you something amazing about it after I say them.
Okay.
It's a little poem called Confiding with a Hen, as in a chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes like this. I tell her the wry truth. We sit in the morning dew, the soil staining. She cocks her head. I can tell she is listening. Her small eyes fill with tilled earth. When I leave, she pecks the ground, searching. That was written by a 14-year-old.
Wow.
Where does a 14-year-old come up with a line like, her small eyes fill with tilled earth? I don't know, but I felt a surge of hope when I read that little poem. I hope you too.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. We're near time. Let me just say, I had a number of things I wanted to say, but I don't have time for them all. So let me just say this. Many times before, and those of you who come the first time, just want to remind you that we meet the third Wednesday of every month, noon to 1:30 Pacific time. Next one is June 19th. So please join us. Please bring other people. We'd like to expand the diversity of the community on these calls, and that's how that happens. There are archives of 5 years of these conversations posted on YouTube. These have also been poured into the AI simulation of me that I just released a couple of weeks ago, trained on these conversations, my writings over all these years, my coaching conversations with my coaching clients. I'll put that link in the chat in just a moment. I mentioned at the top of the call that I'm focusing now on doing one-on-one work with world changers. If that's you, or if that's somebody that you know, I'd be very grateful to talk with you or talk with them about that. This is a work that really grows by personal referral and relationship. And if that's not you, come and check out this thing, which is strange and interesting, and would love to know your experiences with it, what you like, what you don't like. Is it useful? Is it stupid? So that's my request to you on those couple of things. Thank you again for coming. Please stay in touch, and remember, as our friend Brandy Carlisle likes to remind us,
you can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing